From the Depths is a game I covered back in 2021 with a review. This review was by far the most popular video on my channel, and at the time it was my favourite game of all time. For all the games I actually know how long I've played, From the Depths is the one I have the most hours in for any individual game. I believe it's on 1133 at the moment. Because I change games a lot, I don't necessarily stick on one for thousands of hours, so the fact I've put this much into it says a lot. This review will sort of be covering the campaign. And unfortunately, what I have to say about the game is, as I would say, damning praise. It is the same game as it was when I originally covered it. It's not all bad. It is damning praise. The game still has a lot of very good sides. Building is still excellent. So a huge variety of things you can make, and the controls are good. They're some of the best for a building game. Like, it's kind of different to how a lot of other games manage it, but like this sort of whole like keyboard system, I can very quickly put it exactly where I want, rotate blocks to where I want them and everything. So anything I said about in the original review, which again I'll link in the description, still applies. And that review will be covering much more than this one, how you actually will go about building things and things like that. That won't be covered in here. So what's wrong with it? Why am I making this video? Well, first of all, is that the game's not really advanced since the last review. As I said earlier, it's the same thing. There's no major new systems. The one thing they have added that's even that major is an addition to a variant of an existing mode. But I didn't get a chance. The other second thing is that I didn't get a chance to talk about the campaign in the previous review because I hadn't finished it at the time. It took quite a while to actually finish From the Depths campaign. I believe I was like 1,040 hours in. Now that I've done so, as viewers of this channel are probably well aware, you've all seen it. I've been playing through them. I finished the Nita campaign, which is the main campaign of the game, and I finished the Ashes of the Empire campaign, which is the tank-based spin-off. I'll mostly cover them as one thing, because while there's some differences, a lot of it's quite similar. A lot of the mechanics are very similar in a lot of ways. So, how does a game's campaign actually work in practice? Well, you're started with a base, this one specifically, a frankly near worthless starter ship, or tank in case of the other one. It is technically armed, but only in the very vaguest sense of the word. And a goal. Better than that. Just take over the world, destroy every other faction. They're hiding out there in the dark. All of them are defeated by destroying their faction headquarters. Sometimes they have more than one, but most of them are just a single one. Lose your own HQ, this building in this case. I believe it doesn't have to be the headquarters building itself, but the force it's in, so you can theoretically add your own to it and then delete the starter one. But lose this unit, and you lose. It's the only way to lose. Pretty simple. You win by building your own designs, and sending them out into the world to destroy the foe, of course. There's rings, such as this big one here, that are supply zones, or resource patches I believe they're called, that will dig up you can use to dig up material with things like the drills on this base. That's how you forge your various units. Materials are very important, and there will be a bit more on them later on in this review. In concept, no problem at all. This makes perfect sense to me. Build up your forces, get funds to build up more, design your stuff in the editor, which again is the sort of thing I've covered in the first review, and set about it to the world. Cool. In execution, there are problems. Okay. So, it does work. You can wrangle the system into something usable. I've beaten the campaigns. It is doable. It's not so awful that it's a complete nightmare, but it can be a right pain. So, building units is done in several ways. You'll either need a craft with a building blueprint spawner, like this one. You can simply be like, hey, build me a... what do we want? Let's have a patrol. I don't even know if we've got enough money for patrol, but let's build me a patrol craft. And if you've got some repair tentacles on it, on your craft nearby, you've got the resources, they'll put it together. You can also do it by hitting load vehicle and looking at where you want it and loading it in like that. That'll also work. So I actually like watching this. I do like watching them come together. That is one of the few things I'm like, I have no issue at all with this. I actually think that's really fun. You don't have to do it in game. We'll get to the other way you can sort of build stuff later, but I do actually sometimes like just sitting back and watching stuff come together. It is a little clunky, having to have a vehicle with that stuff on it, load it in, actually spawn it, wait for it to build, etc. It's a tiny bit clunky, and you also will probably have to arrange the formations.
Receiving.
See on the map, these little icons, these are each representing a formation and have different craft within them. The starting fortress can't really move, or it can, but it's incredibly slow. So for this patrol craft to be any good, I'd have to separate it out into its own fleet, name the fleet, and then send it off. These names aren't really saved properly when you merge fleets together. It has a bad habit of like changing the name or resetting it to just one of the vehicle names. Could be a bit of a nuisance. It's not a huge thing, but it is the first of many like small problems. Now, it's also where one of the other sort of main systems for the game comes in, and one that can be a bit of a problem at times. Obviously, even if you've got a supercomputer, with the thousands and thousands of craft that, well, I don't know about thousands, but like there might be like 500 craft on the map, maybe, with everyone at full strength. No one's computer could run that. There'd be literally millions of blocks. So the way they kind of handle the campaign is that you pull stuff out of play by clicking pull all. This sort of pulls the vehicles up out of the world so that they're just an icon. It means that they're not actually like taking up any processing power, they're just there on the map. Now, this is actually a good way to do it. I actually do like how they do this in terms of performance level. It really does work, but there are problems with it. First of all is the vehicle's speed. Now, when you build a vehicle, you have the option to set a cruise speed. And the way you do this is you get the vehicle up to full speed, you set the cruise speed, and then you save it. Or you measure cruise speed, which you do from one of the menus, and then you save it. This will tell the game how fast it can go out of combat. Now, cruise speed is normally a bit slower than actual top speed, but it's a good way to do it. I kind of get the idea, like, in a fight, you go up to full speed, whatever. Now, theoretically, if you do this right, it's not a problem. If you didn't know that you had to do this, you might theoretically get to a point, like I did, with a certain set of tanks, or even if you just forget, where you've built, say, like 15 of them, and you didn't know you had to do that. And if you set the cruise for one, it doesn't automatically adjust the others. So I had to manually load in and redo every single one. It's a pain. It's not the biggest one in the world once you know. But the game doesn't particularly tell you this anyway. And it's not the only problem along these lines. Vehicles have to have a type, as you can see up here in the top left. These are sea, all-terrain, amphibious, land, and plane. Now, the reason it does this is because it sets how they move on the map. It'll stop sea vehicles from trying to pathfind through islands. It will allow amphibious vehicles to go over both. It'll stop land vehicles from trying to go over mountains, for example. And it lets air vehicles go anywhere. But the game doesn't actually have a lot, like, enforce this. You could just kind of set it to anything, and there's not really incentive not to, beyond fair play. It's not a huge problem, but it is a bit of one. And you can also set it wrong, because I believe it defaults to air. Or at least that's what it tended to do in the tank campaign. And that kind of has the problem that if you set it wrong, you might end up with a vehicle ending up in a point that it really shouldn't be in. Like, for example, even if you're doing it fairly, you might end up with a ship that spawns on land and then crashes to the ground, or you might end up with a tank that suddenly ends up a mountain and immediately crashes, or drowning in the sea because it can't move, it doesn't have propellers on it. And that leads on to the next issue. I think I shall go to the land of the designer to show off. Let's go. Teleport me over to here, please, game. The land is kind of brutal. Collisions with the terrain. If you're not colliding with the terrain in a way that your vehicle can survive. Throw to the submarine, for example, up in the air. It does quite a lot of damage, depending on how fast you're going. Oop. Yeah, bigger vehicles will tend to take more than that. Now, in a lot of ways, it makes perfect sense, and I'm fine with it. It means aircraft that crash, which already have a natural sort of range and speed advantage, will usually die outright. Fine. Ships will sustain quite a bit of damage if they beach. Tanks can crash. It's not as bad for them because they're bit more resilient to it. Though I do think they do take too much damage, but it does mean, like, say, for example, a tank goes into that hole, it'll probably crash front first and break, or at least damage its armor. And this is all well and good if the vehicles spawn where they're meant to right into the campaign, but that isn't always the case. And those that sit in my land campaign plates who know exactly what I'm talking about here. My little squadrons of... trying to find a thing quickly. It is in land campaign, AT campaign. Yeah, the poor little Momica light tanks. On more than one occasion, I would load into a fight only to realise that they had spawned underground and watch them, like, emerging out of the floor like zombies. Which all kind of fun. Did damage to them. It flipped some of the tanks outright. It did quite a bit of damage. The terrain does spit them out, but it doesn't do it in a safe way. Now, supposedly this has been fixed, but I'm not convinced by that. And the reason it does this is because... Here's the map, for example. Say I've got a base up here, and my character is over there. Well, a fight could start all the way over here with some fleets that are sent out. The game doesn't load the terrain in while you're not there. Especially on the land campaign. Now, it's not too... on the water, no problem at all. It's not a problem in Nida. When you're in the water, though, or when you're on the land, this can be an issue because, of course, the ground level's wrong. Which is why the entire lot spawned underground. Now, you can deliberately teleport to one of your craft before a fight starts, which will load the terrain in, because even if the craft isn't loaded in, it will load the terrain and the game will automatically adjust. But the game never tells you have to do this, and it doesn't do it automatically. So, yeah, it's a real, like, it's a minor thing that can ruin a fight before it even starts, because your fleet just got wrecked by spawning in the ground. It's even worse considering that while they're coming out of the ground, it takes them a moment. They're getting shot at, and they can't move, and they might also be exposing armor angles they're not meant to. There's also two other problems with starting fights, and I'll try and load into... I believe I have a campaign save that should be near some fights, so I can show these off. Load campaign. Yes, for example. So we start a fight here. It's actually in the campaign just for we're about to take on the final boss. When you start a fight, your units get put in position. The position's based on the formation they were in. First of the issues is they're not necessarily facing the right way. You can see my Sky Manta here is actually facing this way, but the enemy's over here. So let's set a position. You also have to set their altitude. Now the way you do this is fine, the actual controls aren't too bad, it's a little jittery, but whatever. You can see as I drag up and down, the altitude increases or decreases. But if you get it wrong, you'll just crash. And there's nothing in the game as far as I'm aware. Yeah, it just goes down to 0, but that terrain's not at 0. Like, that terrain's a mountain. Like, it doesn't really tell you how high up it is, and it's very easy to accidentally, like, smash into a cliff or something. And again, as you said, for the terrain, it's not good. Second is how you actually leave a fight, strangely enough. So, here, we started the fight. If we want to run away during that fight, so it's not going well, we can retreat. So long as we haven't sustained too much damage, and I believe it's about the last 15 seconds, you can run away. And if as long as you're faster, you'll be able to get away from the enemy, and you're fine. Now, if the enemy starts the fight, if they come to you first, and you'll know when a fight starts because they'll get inside your, or was ready to start, because they'll come inside your sort of area of influence, you'll be blockaded. There's nowhere to run away. Yeah, if they start the fight, if you try to retreat, you have to lose everything involved in that battle. It's just destroyed automatically. Doesn't matter if you're faster. Doesn't matter if you're halfway across the map away from them at that point. You could be literally like a surface ship compared to a fast aircraft. You might literally be like 7-10 times faster and well outside of effective range. You just die. You can't retreat. I remember someone actually having a little bit of an argument in the comments about this. One of the people, I say argument, but well, that's maybe more debate. They were quite well-natured, but like, it just doesn't make sense to me. It's absolutely clearly death by game mechanic and nothing else. And it means that even if you have a craft that should be able to run away, it just can't. It's just stuck there. And this had another problem. Because occasionally this would happen with something like, for example, I think it was even in this campaign, I had a few cargo ships. Like cargo starships. They're in space. They were being chased by jets. They were a bit faster than the jets. And they were just stuck fighting. They couldn't run away because they had been attacked first. The only option they had was either let them maybe eventually kill it, which they weren't really able to do because their missiles couldn't really chase it properly in space. Or what I actually did in the end, which was I had to like slap a turret on it mid-fight, use a ton of resources fueling it with ammunition because it wasn't properly set up for it, and wait for it to eventually painfully wear them down. Now, there's a few other ways for a vehicle to die from the depths. There might be more that I didn't encounter. I shall try and show some of the... I don't know if I'm going to show something else, but... Actually, yeah, I can, because I can show them up on Designer. Let's put a couple of crafts in to have a quick fight while I explain this. Let's do a completely unbalanced fight. Let's do a crossbones versus some tiny little... Conestoga. I don't know how you pronounce that, but... So, as you can probably see immediately, this ship's way bigger. It's going to win. It's much more powerful. At least I'm pretty sure it's going to. Oh yeah, this is a cargo ship, so yeah, this should definitely win. There's a few different ways that a victory can happen. The first, which seems to be much more of an issue for the enemy than it does for you, although it could be because I had self-repair systems on the craft where it's happening mostly, destroy their AI. Each of the vehicles has at least one AI that governs how it acts. You can destroy that, either through a direct hit on it, or perhaps an EMP strike. Gigantic explosion like that one. That will kill the craft. One of the other ways is low health, as you just in there. If you destroy, I believe it's about 50% of a vehicle, it'll die. If you sink below the water, having taken at least 20% damage, that'll also kill you. There's the last one that I remember, coming up a lot, there might be more than this, but these are the ones I remember, is entering enemy territory while having taken damage, going into their squares on the map. As you can see, it's sort of divided. Yeah, you can see it here directly. It's divided up into square territories. Now, this last one actually saved me a few times in both campaigns, I believe. But I'm not really sure what's actually killing them. I kind of assume it's like guerrilla warfare or something. Maybe you've set landmines with your terrain or something. It can feel a bit weird. Like a fight that you weren't really meant to have won, you suddenly got a free out to. But the others actually, I would argue, work very well. I actually like how it works. I like the idea that you can either just wreck something to the point where there's only like half of it left and it's like, yeah, there's no way that thing's fighting properly. Or you can sink it like a proper ship. I will note that the AI cheats a little bit. A lot of the AI, this one probably doesn't need it because it's wood. No, it does have them. Yeah, a lot of the AI will use lift propellers to just push it up because they're actually too heavy to float. Which is a little feeling to me, but whatever. And there's also a way to sustain your vehicle as well. If you are dying, but you've got a repair craft nearby repairing it, you get 100 seconds extra time to live, basically. And again, I believe the AI death thing doesn't affect you if you've still got working self-repair systems until they're knocked out or you hit another death condition. I think you can also die being completely out of resources, so you don't end up with stalemate in which, like, both craft can't hurt each other. To break away from combat for a little bit, for a moment, supplies is another key part of the campaign. I'll load back into the campaign again to show it. As mentioned, craft that's at a resourcing point, like for example,
listening.
I'll load it in my refineries here, back at home base, can mine resources. You do it with the drills. You have a set amount that the resource patches can generate every, I think it's every second, and you can mine up to that much. And you can use them for whatever. Resources can be stored on ships, either to move them or to use them for fuel and ammunition. Now, it does have a resource management system. This is supposed to allow for either gifting commodities, which we'll get to later, or for setting like how much of a vessel's total capacity it wants to keep, how much energy it wants to keep, which is usually much less of an issue, and how it wants to share resources around. Theoretically, this should allow for fairly easy automation of miners picking stuff up, cargo ships then collecting it, and then bringing it back to things that will use it. In practice, it never seemed to work very well. It did require some babysitting. It's functional, but there was quite a lot of fiddling with it. There's also two other ways to gain material. Those are salvage. I don't think there'll be any salvage points available, unless there's any recent fights we ended. I'm not seeing any, but when you destroy an enemy craft, or a friendly craft gets destroyed, it'll drop some salvage. Friendly craft, you get the full value of the craft that was destroyed. For enemy craft, you only get some. I think it's about 10-15% by default. There's also another way to do it, which is diplomacy. Oh, not that it's actually going to come up because we've only got one opponent left. But normally, every, I believe it's 2 hours, there'll be a meeting. There won't be one here because we've only got one opponent. But this meeting will allow you to basically pick who you want to fight. Depending on who you choose, sometimes it might be a single opponent, sometimes it might be multiple. You might either get bribed by the other factions, they'll give you a resource, they'll give you commodities, or you might have to pay them to take the fight. I don't know why, but yeah, sometimes you might actually get complained at for doing a fight and you have to pay the others. Now, like materials... Well, no, sorry, not like materials. Commodities are like materials, but they are sort of materials plus. They're down here. Nearby material is how much is actually nearby. Commodities are kind of like a global resource. You can access them anywhere, and you can put them into your vehicles mid-fight even if you want to. The difference is to make commodities, you don't make them normally like the materials that you mine up. You need something like the refineries that I've got here. It's a craft that has to hold at least 1 million resources, which is quite a lot. That's not a small amount. And then fit refinery gear to it, like these smokestacks and things. And that will gradually tick over materials into commodities. It's not quite 1-to-1. It does depend a bit on how efficient your refinery is. But it's worth doing. If you've got to the point where you can make them, you probably should. Having them anyway is very useful. Now, I believe the idea of the refineries is that they're supposed to be sort of vulnerable targets. The refinery equipment is explosive by default. But I don't think I've ever had one actually really be attacked, or at least not one that was actively running. Because they don't run until you've got at least 1 million resources stored on board. If this was meant to be something the AI targets, I've never seen them specifically do it. They will clear off your stuff. They will clear resource points and retake them, but I've never seen them particularly target them over my other stuff. The thing is, diplomacy kind of offers you more than any of the others, usually. You can mine a decent amount in Nita, not so much in the land campaign. It's a bit more limited, but your craft in general is smaller, so it sort of checks out. But, like, I believe I got like a 1.9 or 7 million commodity offer at one point. And, like, the most effective craft I've ever built, which was that sort of flying wing you saw flying around at the start of the review, that's only like a, oh wait, no, it might need to be here. That's only like a 300,000 resource craft. Like, and the most expensive thing we ever built, which was the flagship, was pretty much fully funded by a single diplomacy offer. If you're willing to, like, consider switching opponents, like, mid-campaign, you can make a lot of resources off of this. And it's even more so in the tank campaign. Like, it was worth even more. I could build, like, entire, like, platoons of tanks off a single, like, decent offer. I actually do like this system, though. I don't think this is a bad part at all. It grants a nice big resource injection. It lets you splash out on some expensive stuff or repair if you're in a bad state. And it incentivizes taking opponents you might not necessarily. You might decide to fight 2 at once. And I did it a couple of times. Like, at least in the tank campaign. I didn't do it in Nita. I specifically stuck to 1 in that. But when you get to a fight, you sort of realize, and I sort of touched upon this earlier, the amount of pitfalls that can happen before a fight. So first is your fleet composition. Your machines don't fight the same way in big fleets they do on their own. Especially also when you didn't realize that the game's difficulty also adjusts damage settings. So things like the flagship that I mentioned earlier, I went to take on something that it was reasonably even against in the designer, and it just wasn't in practice. But that's not too bad. I sort of expected stuff like that. What was not so good is that A, the terrain, B, the altitude thing. There's just loads of these little things that could spoil a thing. And to go back to resources where we're at, to sort of finish my point, there's no warning if your fleet is just out of resources when a fight starts. They'll still move at full speed. So you might find you just suddenly start a fight, and all of your ships just drop out of the sky. Or you don't even realise that they're out of materials, and you're like, that's strange, I'm not firing at full power, and then you realise, like, you know, everyone's, like, fired off their first volley and then ran out of stuff, kind of thing. So, this sounds kind of bad. But how is the actual campaign? What are the fights actually like? Like, even if the fights are, like, a little janky when you're actually loading them in and everything, and, like, there's a lot of things you could forget by accident, how actually are the opponents? And how are the actual fights? Well, they're pretty good. There's Actually, probably a good screen to guard for optimization, given there's nothing happening on it. Performance is actually pretty good. In fights, you get to set a volume limit. It'll come up in the bottom right when you go to start a fight. And that sets how much of everything can load in at one time. For example, whether you want just like one Marauder loaded, or you want... if you want 20 of them, for example. To give you an idea of the optimization, Marauder's not a tiny craft, but it's actually reasonably chunky. The game's running pretty alright, even with like 20 of these things loaded in, and they're all made of like, how many blocks each? Almost 3,000 parts each, and it's just like, yeah, here's 20 of them pootling about, no problem. Like, it'll run a bit slower if there's an enemy here, but I can show it off in practice. It's probably the easy way to do it. Something like a godly white flail. Let's summon in the Leviathan. Actually, I don't think I ever saw this in the campaign. This might be a new thing. Yeah, enemies loaded in. It's 20 other foes. This one's enormous by comparison. He's like 20,000 blocks. Running reasonably okay. Performance is actually one thing where I'd say the game is very good. My PC could reliably in the campaign handle around 100,000 to 120,000 on the block count. The frame rate did start to suffer once you got past about the 90,000 mark. You can see it's not perfectly smooth. But I'm recording at the same time. It's pretty good, especially given all it's doing. And if you watch some of the bigger YouTubers with beefier machines playing the game, it scales well too. They can run some really huge stuff. Like, the game actually scales up quite nicely. So you hear there's like stuff dying, there's like collisions happening, but it's still running pretty okay. And like, most of the visuals are fine. Looks alright. I do hate the blurry effect that happens if you are injured, because your character can sort of die, and we'll get back to that later, because I have some stuff to say about that. You can sort of die, but when you're just injured, so you get an explosion splash near you, you get this sort of watery grey filter over the screen, and it's really hard to see anything, and it takes forever to go away. It's really annoying. I do not like that. Sound is also fine. Music's okay. Broadsides can be a bit deafening if you have a big, like, cram cannon like broadsider and every single gun fires at once. It's kind of deafeningly loud. That is one of the two things I'm like, yeah, no, that could do a bit of work. But it's pretty good overall. I think it's quite loud by default, but that's like, just turn the settings down a little bit. As for the enemies themselves, they're great. They're still good. There's some new designs. There's some that have been improved. They're all really good. They look great. There's often very unusual ideas. They can be extremely tough. Shout out to the it's the infinite suffering that is the Megalodon. We'll get to you later. Yes, we will. But this thing caused me no end of problems. It's a very tough little craft, but it's cool looking. I can't fault it on that. It's very cool looking. Yeah, just this thing. I have to mention this because it's true. I don't know if any of you guys have ever watched this show called One Piece. It's very good. Very popular anime, very popular manga series. I think it's like one of the top in the world, and it certainly was the top for a while. There's a bit very early on where Zoro, one of the main characters, has to take on the world's greatest swordsman, Mihawk. And he gets his backside handed to him. It's really early on. It's like first 20 episodes. It's not spoiling much. The show's like, what is it, 1,050 plus episodes long at this point. But he just has this moment of realizing how far away the top really is. He's like, oh, he's like really strong for like where he started, but he's like nothing compared to the guy who's actually the best. And it's like, this makes me feel like that. Like, this Megalodon makes me feel that feeling of like, oh no, the top can't be this far away. Like, but it is. Unfortunately, it is. But there's one other thing I want to talk about before we start going over the individual campaigns. That's what you could do in a fight. Your character could do a few things. And he's busted. He's totally busted. Let's spawn in a Marauder here, as an example. Where actually is it? Are we a long way off? Yes. Teleport me next to it. Or onto it. That works too. Here's the thing. You can move around during battles. You don't actually have to be anywhere near them, but you can. Normally, you'd watch the battle from one of your ships, probably your flagship. But you can get out, and you can run around, and you can run around on enemy crafts. Once you're on them, even if they're really fast, once you get stuck to them, you do have a sort of literal like magnetic boots. You stick to them, and you're armed, with like some quite powerful stuff. There's grenade launcher, for example. Case in point, that's the Marauder's engine, and I've just cut through that in what, like, .nothing of a second. There's the AI. Oh, it's just probably dead at this point. I probably just killed it or captured it. Yeah, I've captured it. I knocked out the AI and captured it. Now, the other vehicles in the campaign are a bit tougher than that. The Marauder is not a resilient vessel. In fact, it's like #1 targeting barge for most people. But like, testing. But it's not difficult to just destroy things. And you don't die permanently. You can be killed, but you'll just respawn. And again, once you're... you can't really be stopped from doing that. You could just run to a vehicle, shoot out the AI and pirate it, or you could cut through their magazine wells and blow up their turrets. You could just do untold damage to the enemy like this, and nothing really stops you. And I'll admit I've done this in the campaign, and I'm not even proud of this, but like, there was a fight at one point where it came down to a bunch of my tanks on one side, very badly damaged, and a semi-blinded, it had a lot of its detection system shot out, railgun turret on the other. And I had a choice. I either waited for my tanks to maybe kill it, but they're very light tanks, they didn't have very powerful guns, they were not doing much damage to this quite heavily armoured turret, or I had to go up to it and minigun it to death, or wait for it to just kill me by the occasional lucky shot it would actually land. Because it was killing them in one hit, it just wasn't hitting them. Now, I chose to prioritise my time, and I minigunned it. But it wasn't a good episode. I got complained at for it, and I'm like, yeah, no, it wasn't great. Like, I did have to prioritise my time, but it wasn't a good episode. It wasn't really what I wanted to be doing either. Like, I didn't want to be minigunning it, but I didn't want to lose to just, like, waiting to be slowly plinked off. It might have taken, like, 20 minutes. It's not a fast game. Yeah. The problem is, it's kind of needed. There's the occasional moment where both sides' crafts will be really badly wounded and none are really capable of finishing each other off. Or even just some stuff where the game's a bit cheesy and will, like, AI spoof things. It's a trick to make it harder for you to actually, like, kill something by having fake AIs that aren't doing anything. I don't think this is the best way to do it, but it is a problem that was there. And there's another thing you can do as well, which makes you even more powerful, almost. If you're in control of a craft, if we go to, say, the control chair, we can override the weapons. There's that audio problem I mentioned earlier. I forgot that would be something, but yeah, you can hear how much the sound is overlapping. Now, normally, the AI will go, oh, I'm targeting, sees what the targeting conditions are. That craft over there, for example. I know it's a seagull, but that craft over there, yes, I'm watching you, shoot that. What will it aim for? Well, it'll go, do I have an aim point card? If I don't, just aim for something on it. If I have an aim point card, I'll aim for like either hot things or clusters of blocks or center mass. And it'll shoot at that. If you override the guns, you can target something very specific. Why is the camera spinning? What the heck? Why isn't that happen? What? That's a new one. Interesting. I can't think of any craft that have a particular weak point on... No, I can. I can think of something that has a particular weak point on it. Structure... No, Grey Towns. Is that the one? No, that's not it. So I just got to find the thing now. Is it structure? No, it's a installation, isn't it? Raven's Nest, you should sell... Raven's Nest. Here we go. I'm about to get blown up, by the way, when I load this in. That thing will shred that little barge thing in no time at all. Yeah. Right. See this thing here? This is a Grey Talon's Fortress. We'll actually talk about this a little later on, because I have some good memories of fighting this thing. But see this centre column here? This centre column here has one of its defensive systems contained within, or at least it used to. I believe it's still there. Yeah, it's still there. Firing on this thing normally is really difficult. It might not necessarily look it, but the sheer bulk of this thing makes it a nightmare to actually damage it. It's got incredibly powerful, again, defense system that will just eat up a lot of your shots. They just won't hit it. Now, if you can aim for the defense column, you can kill it a lot quicker. But there's no real way to guarantee this with just the default AI conditions. If you're aiming for center mass, it's going to aim way higher up where the huge armor belt is. But you can override the AI, and you can tell it, shoot here. You can say, like, nah, I want this craft to specifically focus fire on this point here, and kill the thing. Or you could even tell it to, like, shoot through holes that you've made in the armor that it's not hitting normally. And this sort of drastically increases the firepower and thing. Now, I don't mind this too much, but the problem is the accuracy system with all the detection system doesn't really apply so much when you're doing this. It just aims for that point. It's also sort of aiming better than your crafts can. And it's one of these things where it's like, it's cool that you could do it. I do think it's fun. But for balance's sake, not so sure. What about the creaky chair? But, moving on, time to cover the actual campaigns. It's technically 4. Or 5, I forgot about that one. Oh no, it's 4. It's technically 4. I've done 2 of them. But to explain quickly, Nita is the main thing. I'd written in my script that it's the most complete. It even says so here. Yeah, Nita is the one with by far the most in it. It's primarily set on the ocean. There are some medium-sized islands, but they're not really big or flat enough to warrant running tanks or even amphibians, really. It's just not really kitted out for them. Enemy ships enemy forces, primarily you'll find ships, airships. You'll get the odd submarine. Space is technically a thing, but only the game's final faction actually does anything with it, and I believe they've got, like, what, 2 orbital weapons platforms that are in space, and that's it. Which is a real shame, because space handles a bit differently to every other area in the game, and they could do a bit more with it, but they kind of don't. The other main one is actually the Empire. It's set before the main campaign, has a few less factions, but it's tank-based, it's land, it's mostly flat, there's the odd lake, but it's mostly land-based. It's also pretty good, as I both use pretty good. Glau isn't really functional at the moment, it is being worked on, but we'll get to Glau later. And the Xmas Planet was a little goofy one that they did for the season. I've not played it. I assume this red flashing means it's going to go away at some point, but it's March at this point, and March is nearly over, so who knows. Now, on to Nita, which we'll start with. You've got several factions to fight. I'll show these off very quickly, but I did this in the previous review, but I'm going to do it a little bit anyway, because I like showing them off, and I think they really are good. They are kind of this sort of oddball pirate faction, and they're the starter faction. Very much so. They are armoured primarily in wood, with bits of metal. They've often got, like, paddle wheels and things, very sort of primitive technology. Sometimes, I think they've got some actual sailcraft in there. Not many, but some. Yeah, they're a bit weird looking as well. I do love them, though. And I think as a starter faction, they're perfect. I genuinely think they're a really good starter faction. They're not heavily armoured enough that you can't hurt them very easily. They do have weaponry, but it's low power. They're weird and wacky, so they give you ideas, especially where people are setting off with the game. But they have some actual function. And when you get to the high end, like the Crossbones is like a reasonably serious ship. It's not impossible to defeat. It is still primarily armoured in wood. But it's well designed, and the cannons will actually put out the hurt, so they can bring up a fight when they want to. And again, it's the first foe. I think they're great. After them, the Onyx Watch. The Bulwark is like their main one, and also I like is the Kingstead here still? Yes. These two that probably showed off. I probably ought to get one of their... God, what's their sailing... I can't for life remember what it's called. Clydesdale, that's the one. The Onyx Watch are kind of split into 2 separate factions, which, apologies for how long it took me to find the right ones. Half their fleet is sailboats. They usually tend to have very powerful broadsides. Some of them are a lot bigger broadsides than this. They usually would. This seems to be a bit of a halfway house between the two. You've got a little ballista-esque looking weapon on the front there. Their thing, as you can probably tell from this thing, is tremendous armour. That's probably fairly solid. Okay, maybe not. But huge air gap. Yeah, their thing is normally heavy armour, slow, these big powerful crown cannons. Now, they're actually kind of set up to be like the second faction you fight. You might think with that heavy armour they'd actually be a real danger, but they're kind of not actually that great. While they've got crown cannons that hit hard, they're very vulnerable to them, because crown cannons aren't very fast or accurate, but that doesn't matter with the sheer size of these things. They're actually vulnerable to their own weapons. And since crams struggle to hit aircraft so much, it's very easy to just fly around them. And a lot of the time, you'll probably even knock their guns out before they sink. So they'll just be sat there just being shot repeatedly. And again, aircraft will just run rings around them. They can't really fight aircraft well. Now, a few of the newer ones can. I do notice the devs have started sneaking in some advanced cannons hidden within the shell of a crown cannon. Or just outright mounted on the ship like these ones here. Probably to beef them up a little bit, but yeah, I think as this sort of second-ish faction, they're a reasonably good choice. And after a minor cut to rest my voice for a second. Next up, we have the Lightning Hoods. The Lightning Hoods are a bit of a weird one in that I think they're actually one of the harder factions, despite how early on in the game you can actually encounter them. This is one of their biggest crafts, doing an absolute speed demon. Because yes, they are very quick, they tend to have lightish armour, and they tend to run hovercrafts or low-flying actual hovering ships. This one's actually hydrofoils or hover ships even. But I knew it was a H. Now, their primary weapons tend to be lasers, particle cannons, or occasionally I believe they use missiles. Oh, this is actually their cargo ship. How fast it is going backwards for a cargo ship. Hey, there's a couple of those particle cannons, even if they might be... No, I was going to say they might be hiding lasers on the inside. No, I... Actually, no, what are they? You mind? I'm trying to film a review. Yeah, no, they are lasers on the inside. I was going to say sometimes they deco them out and cheat a little bit. Now, speed... The reason I think these guys are so strong is because they're fast. Speed's really strong in From the Depths. Fast-moving craft can not only sort of react a lot quicker and better on the map because they can move faster and reach places faster, but in combat it makes them way harder to hit. Now there is a... Going out of control. Is he about to crash? I'll leave him to that while I continue on my train of thought. Now while there is an accuracy penalty in the game, which was just intended to like bring down the power of high-speed aircraft and things by making weaponry less accurate when fired from the air at high speed, kind of doesn't matter on some weapons. Lasers have hit scan. They don't care about accuracy really. Particle cannons are exactly the same, and although they care a little bit more. And missiles are self-guided, so they literally don't care about what launches them as long as they don't crash into it. And this is compounded a bit by the fact that lasers, like they're armed with, let's show them off a bit. Let's spawn in a... I don't know what a battery is, but let's spawn one in. Oh, it's tiny. Yeah. So, really heavy armour. Doesn't matter. Lasers don't really react in the same way that any other weapon system does. Same with particle cannons, in that lasers are only blocked by certain very specific defences that aren't the normal ones. The particle cannons can't be blocked by anything. They just go through. So, playing against them kind of feels different than the others. And it also means that a lot of what you might have built to defend your early ships against the Deepwater Guard probably doesn't work against these guys, if you can even catch up with them in the first place. I do like their visuals though. I like the green, I'm gonna lie. And actually managing to beat them in the campaign after all the struggles was pretty good feeling. I've probably lost the Lightning... I think I've lost the Lightning Hoods more than literally anything else, because they're the only ones that have really beaten me before, apart from really early days against the Deepwater Guard. Next faction is the White Flares. They're a bunch of, I think the only way to say it honestly is religious nutjobs, but of the very murdery variety. They like their high-speed ramming craft, like the Karen over here. Notice the big blade on the front, and yes, melee does a ton of damage. It's difficult to get to, but it really does hurt. You do not want to get hit by melee weapons in this game. I think his buddy is about to find out, unless he floats over him. No, he actually moved away. Good piloting there. Yeah, you might notice some nice characteristic things like the grinder. Again, religious nutjobs. What? I just noticed he's got floaties on. What is going on here? But anyway. But the thing is, despite theoretically being quite strong, they're armed with like rapid fire, armor-piercing weapons, and they have some stronger craft like these bigger ones. They're like railguns as well. In the campaign, they were a total joke. There's no other way to put it. One ship put up a good bit of resistance, but was eventually destroyed. Were hopped a few by sky rays over the mountains that defend their base, and shredded their HQ. It took almost no effort to beat them. I think it took like an episode or two, almost nothing. And I never got a good read on them. I do like how they look. I love them in concept. Absolutely puny in game, in practice. Perhaps some people might have more trouble with them, but I absolutely did not. Which is kind of sad, because it basically meant that entire faction was completely redundant for my playthrough. They didn't matter. But we're now past the early game. Next one is Steel Striders. They're the sort of pseudo-realistic lot. Let's load in, yeah, a few of the ones that I like. they tend to have the more realistic warships. They'll have some that actually are quite close to real warships. This idea, there's an Excalibur. It's one of my favourite craft. It's literally a World War II-esque battleship. Primary guns, maybe a few... I don't even think it has torpedo. No, it has a few little torpedo mounts. You have somewhat more futuristic stuff, like the Meg here. And they have the odd extra thing, but they also tend to use a lot of things like helicopters and submarines. This is a Thunder Gel. I do very much like, I believe, sort of monitor type ship. Now, they're pretty fun for the most part. I like them. They're great inspiration if you like shipbuilding. But this thing, I would argue, doesn't belong in the campaign, or at least it should only spawn at like the highest difficulties. It's too strong. The Megalodon is an absolute quantum leap beyond anything I'd fought before. I had to throw everything into it, and most of it just died, like doing very little damage to it. It's basically like this because its defense system's near indestructible. It's got a very good Seawards turret, extremely powerful lasers, very good armor scheme. It's generally really built tough. And I put a lot into building our flagship to fight it, and it did reasonably okay in I'll load it in actually here. It did actually reasonably okay in testing. I just found out later on that the game adjusts damage when you're in the campaign if you've got the difficulty settings up, which I did a little bit. So I put so much into building this, so much effort, so much thought, so much time, and it just got squashed. It just didn't stand a chance, it just died. You can already see like huge amounts of stuff being smashed off. Look how much redundant armor and things this one's got. It's not a feeble like warship, but it can't really stand up to this thing. Not that it can't do any damage. I think we're about to see some here, but you can see some of its countermeasures at work. You can see the lasers hitting the torpedoes. You can see like counter missiles being launched. All sorts. Did have that nice effect of leaping up onto the deck to hit it. See, I'm definitely losing, although to be fair, he does have an Excalibur helping him. But yeah, so that was a bit of a sad moment. I'd sort of really set my hopes on this thing, and it was just kind of depressing watching it just lose this thing that nothing could seemingly take down. And then we did beat it, but I didn't actually kill it. You might remember I mentioned a while back what could kill vehicles. The Megalodon strayed into my territory, and it had taken enough damage that killed it. And I don't know how to feel about it. But on the one hand, that might have just killed me. I didn't really have a way to beat it. It might, theoretically, especially under humans' control, a human could have set it straight for my headquarters and I wouldn't have been able to stop it. But it meant I just got a free win. I got handed one that I really shouldn't really have been, I don't think. I don't know how to feel about it. But to continue with the other factions, and one that went a bit better, we have the Twin Guard. I don't know what is their mechs called. I'm trying to find something very specific here with their thruster crafts. No. Range? I'm on the Twin Guard, yeah. Maybe they've renamed some of them. But yeah, the Twin Guard are a futuristic faction. They're literally robots. Oh no, yeah, they have been renamed because that's one over there. Some of them are very literal. They have little mechs, and they're really cool. Oh my god, I love this guy. I hadn't seen this one, actually. This one's new. Look at that face. Yeah, they're really cool looking for like a sort of advanced sci-fi. Look at this giant minigun that they've decoed up. Or this sort of combination weapon system with a little shield. These are like two-part builds where the base is a separate part to the top, and it can repair the top part. Because the way repair systems work, you can use repair tentacles on a ship like that. Yeah, they've got these nice sci-fi looks. And they're kind of a mix between those and drone swarms. Yeah, they're like these little swarms of tiny little craft. I believe some other factions use a few, but Twin Guard are really going on it. A lot of the time, yeah, they'll have like coordinators, or some of their bigger ships will build them mid-fight. They'll literally like manufacture little ships like this size and just throw them at you mid-fight. Now, admittedly, in Nita, they're mostly kind of a joke. If I'm perfectly honest, they're not really strong enough to hurt you. By the time you've got to them, if you've got that far, they're probably not really that much of a danger. Now, this is a little different in the tank campaign. In the tank campaign, where they're a bit closer to the size of your craft, they can actually be a bit of a threat. And the other thing they have that's a bit of a threat is EMP, which is one that they specifically use quite a bit of. I don't like EMP. I've made this clear, and a lot of the community agrees with me. It is a bit split, but EMP is a bit of an all-or-nothing weapon. If you're hit by it, it will send like an electric surge through your ship, and if it gets to components that run things like weapon controllers or your AI, remember the one that if it dies, you die, it'll just destroy them really easily. And the problem is, with the way you resist it, usually either you built your defenses well enough and it just does nothing, or you haven't built your defenses well enough and you just die immediately and you can't really do anything about it. I do not like it. I've almost never used it. I think there were a few times where I was forced to at least try it. But, yeah. It was a pain, but not this amount of one. But we're on to the endgame factions. Grey Talons. The Grey Talons are my favourite. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I really like the Grey Talons. Their airships in as well. The way they work is that the Grey Talons are entirely airborne. They're all airships covered in guns. I mean, yeah, look at this thing. I think it's a Hobgoblin. No, Great Axe. Yeah, look at these things. They've got a bit of a Warhammer 40k vibe, which I obviously like. Oh, that's cool. I hadn't seen these patterns actually. Those are really nice. This is the ship I have not seen. This might be a new one that's been added since. I have seen this before. Yeah, they're all airborne. They have these cool airships with loads of stuff, and of course they have the base. Oh, it was this installation, wasn't it? The Raven's Nest. Now the Grey Talons, if the Twin Guard have 2 bases, because it's 2 AI robots, cool. Most of the factions have 1 base, or I think Steel Striders have like 3 headquarters. The Grey Talons have about 6 of these things, and they're monstrous. They are so tough. You need a decent assault to break these things. And one of my favourite memories of the whole game was during the campaign, watching one of the Eaters, which is a copy I made of it's like a sword spaceship from Yamato 2202, with a nuke on the tip, basically, managing to slip past its defences and ram the LAM system and break the defences on one of them, allowing me to actually destroy it. It's like one of my favourite moments from the whole game. I love the Grey Talons. I love how they look. It's like little bits moving like the windmills and things. I had nothing bad to say about them. For where they are in the game, they're difficult, and they should be. And they're difficult in a very fair way. They've got good speed, they've got good firepower, decent armour, but they're not busted, they're not using any sort of exploity feeder mechanics. I really like them. And lastly, on to the final one, Scarlet Dawn. Scarlet Dawn are an interesting one. They are meant to be the strongest in the game. And at the high end, they are. We didn't encounter a lot of their strongest ships in our campaign, because of something that I will get to in a minute. But some of their stuff like I think that's the Singularity, right? Yeah, this is one of the strongest ships in the whole game. At least it was. It warps to avoid damage, it flies, it's very tough, it's got very good firepower. That is a really bright glow on that. You see they deploy all sorts of countermeasures. This thing's letting off laser-proofing smoke. Look at those monstrous looking turrets. But yeah, they use any weapon system. They're just generally built to be strong, and they're very, very cool. I hadn't seen this one either. I love this, the counter-rotating center. Again, one of the things I will not fault the game for is new craft have been added and old ones have been updated. They also have the big bad of the game, the Scarlet Dawn itself. In the lore, the Scarlet Dawn is the thing that started this whole mess. It is literally an alien spacecraft that came to invade. And the problem is, in-game, it was a total pushover. Yeah. So theoretically, it's quite dangerous. It actually has reasonably powerful lasers. It flies. It's got quite powerful railguns, I think. But what actually happened in practice was that it spawned into fight. I'd have to beat something else first to even get it to show up. And with about 2 missile volleys and a few laser shots, the turret exploded on the bottom and sent such a massive EMP surge through the whole ship that it fried its own brain. It was over in less than a minute, and it was the final fight of the game. It was funny. but it was not what I'd expected from the game's final boss. I'd expected something like what I'd heard about the Singularity. Yeah, and it was a bit of an underwhelming ending. Now, this looks like it's had some slight work done on it. I think the turret had more barrels, so that makes me... Oh, no, it does have 4. It does look like it's had some work done on it, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's still vulnerable to the same thing. But, despite everything, it was still a good campaign. I think it still is a good one. I can't imagine it's changed drastically since the last review, the last playthrough. It ran me for about 35 hours. Part-time is about 40, so I cannot fault the game's value for money. It's not an expensive game. It is only about 25, 30-ish, I think. I might have to actually check that later, but... And my actual playtime for the game at that point was like 1,040 hours-ish. It is a good campaign. It's just let down by those management issues. The awkwardness with starting fights, the amount of little tiny things that can go wrong and kill you. There's a few other aspects that are vaguely worth mentioning, but the main one I can think of for now is detection. Normally you can't see the whole map, you have to have radar dishes on something to see it. Unfortunately, the easiest way to see the map is just to almost negate the mechanic by just adding a big radar dish on something that flies very high up and you're sort of done. Especially if it's really cheap like my radar balloons, it's just like, oh, I can now just, for a few thousand resources, just see the whole map. Yeah, there it is, 5,000 resources. This will reveal like a huge chunk of the map for its size and its cost, which is almost nothing. Fly up into space, doesn't use any resources. It costs a bit to build, but doesn't use any resources at all because it's powered by RTGs. Can't fight for anything, but it's got no guns, but it just completely handles recon. I also love the way it flies. It does fly a bit like a drunk jellyfish, and I rather like it. Now, the tag campaign, which I'll switch over to now, is broadly the same thing. I do mean broadly. It's not quite identical. The map is entirely land, so it's a lot more hospitable to land units in than it actually is. I'll load in one that I'm going to use for an example of something in a minute, which is the Rosalie. Yes. Good example tank that I've made. Didn't quite get around to decorating this one because it's so close to the end of the series, but I do like how the land handles. I do think ground handling from these vehicles is actually pretty good. You don't get so many issues of like Kerbal's weird like slidey terrain, or Stormworks is extremely slidey terrain. The actual handling of land vehicles is great, and that's something a lot of games get wrong, so full marks there. You can bring aircraft if you like. Given we had a few supply issues of how long it took to ship stuff around, because land vehicles aren't quick, most of mine didn't do more than about 30, and the aircraft we were building in Nita did about could do like 100, some of them. But you can't do it entirely on land. I did, ultimately. I kept meaning to build an Air Force and eventually just decided, we'll just do it full tanks. Every management issue from the previous campaign is still here. It's actually made a little bit worse because you tend to have more resourcing points, which means more supply finagling. I was starting to get the hang of the auto system by that point, but even then it wasn't working perfectly. Factions are broadly similar. You have the Dustwind Guard / Gypsies, depending on which tooltip you're reading, because I believe they changed it to Guard, but some of the tooltips or descriptions of areas don't have the updated sign, so they still call it the old name. But they are broadly the same, as you can see by this thing rumbling along here. They're still scrappy pirates, armoured mostly in wood. They're a little bit more competent on land, actually. Their tanks are a little bit better designed than their ships tend to be, but they were a pushover. We did not have any trouble fighting them. And that was even before we had some of the heavier tanks like this even available. I hadn't even built this thing when we took them on. It really didn't take any effort to kill them. They're not even necessarily a starter faction. They don't even... I don't believe they actually are... No, I think you start next to everybody, but they're not guaranteed to be the first one you fight, so they're kind of weird in this. Next up, Lightning Hoods. They're still in it. The Lightning Hoods are actually one of the biggest, walls that I hit in this campaign. They're scary. They are nasty in this campaign. You can probably see a bit of a scale difference, which we'll get to later. They're still the same sort of idea. A few missiles, lasers, particle cannons. My poor Rosalie is getting torn apart by this. Oh god, yeah, and they've got a few weapons like that. I actually do really like this with a giant laser weapon. I don't have any I don't have any hatred against their designs. It's just that I struggle against them. But they had the same issues. You don't really defend against them in the same way. It's actually kind of hard to build energy tanks. It's not completely impossible, but because energy weapons really do scale non-linearly, and we'll get to this because this is going to come up later, the likelihoods kind of have a big advantage in that they can build much better energy weapons than you can. The white scars was still a total joke. I wish I could say otherwise. They did a little bit more damage. They actually did kill a few of my tanks. They're still nasty if you get to melee. I'd forgot to talk about this, but I'm going to now. While I've said this. This is one of their supply vehicles. For some reason, the supply vehicles in the land campaign did more damage to us than most of the actual combat tanks, and I'm not making this up. I don't know why. But their combat craft actually tended to be quite heavily armed and actually did quite a lot of damage to us. Usually. Fairly reliably, too. Oh, that's cool looking. I hadn't seen this. I don't think this one was in our... I don't think this was in when we did the campaign, or at least if it was, I never saw it. Actually, I think someone on the Discord was building this. Maybe they were the one that actually designed it. Maybe it wasn't in that at the time. But yes, still a bit of a joke. They were a bit harder, but we really did not struggle that much to kill them. And I believe a lot of their losses came to going into rough terrain like this, which tanks can't drive on, because they go really fast. And again, terrain is scary. So yeah, I think a lot of their losses, if I remember correctly, there was one at least where he... Not quite as bad as this. Yeah, we got terrain like this, and they crashed a few times and just smashed themselves up. We lost a few to that too, but not as bad as they did. The terrain is still weird in the land, by the way. In fact, I would say it's a little bit worse. We had the odd instance of things clipping through the floor. Missiles was one of the main ones. The Scarlet Dawn and the Grey Talons, not here. Onyx Watch, I literally didn't write anything about them in my script. Although, I lie. I wrote in my script, they were either so much of a non-event that I forgot about them, or they weren't here. And apparently they were here. I completely forgot about them. They left so little of an impression on me on land that I totally forgot we actually fought them. And they weren't awful, I don't think. Their supply vehicle really did a number on us. In fact, it might even be this. Well, we certainly fought this thing a few times. It was this Longhorn. But, yeah, I totally forgot about them until I saw them just now. Like, they kind of do nothing in that campaign. Steel Empire? Oh, the Steel Empire is scary. So these are the two factions that do play... them and the Grey Talons, Twin Guard even, do play notably different in Ashes of the Empire. Sorry if I've got a script. I'm drifting off of it slightly, because that's how I roll. Steel Empire have what are actually some pretty nasty vehicles. They're very well optimized compared to the thing. They also have some little drone tanks, which is very cute. I'd forgotten about these things as well until I saw them just now. But yeah, they have some little drone tanks. A little bit Warhammerish. This is a bit like a Predator tank, especially with that turret. Very cool, though. I do like the Hadron. I hate fighting it, but I like the Hadron's looks. I actually did steal one of their ideas, which is these little countermeasure missile launchers. I actually stole that from my own tanks. Big stuff like this looks a little bit like a sci-fi basilisk. But yeah, I love their designs. They look great as ever, and I like the slightly more realistic look. I do like this interesting... They've all got this sort of, like, the turret sort of idle pan. I hadn't noticed that before. That might be new. But their armor schemes are weird. The internals, maybe not so much on this one, but certainly on stuff like the buggy, no, there it is, seem weird. It's like, why are there like these weird wedges and things? There's very good meta reasons why you build armor like this, but it feels weird, and it means they take a lot more firepower than they look like they ought to. Every one of these things is a danger. They're not cheap tanks, but they're not horribly expensive either. 80,000 is not nothing for this campaign, but they could do that much damage quite easily if you're not careful. And they kind of make a lot of anti-tank weapons not really work like anti-tank weapons. Like, those beams will stop Hesh and heat pretty well most of the time. It sort of means that, like, you think, oh, I developed a shell that could do this. No, it can't. Admittedly, not that I did. I focused very heavily on missiles during this campaign, but I did have some gun tanks towards the end. The other faction that plays very different is the Twin Guard. By which I mean they kind of play the same, but they have a lot of big stuff, and they have a lot of scary stuff. I actually can't remember what the final boss was. I think it was the Nemesis. It actually ended up being the thing I fought last in the whole campaign. Maybe even the Suzaku, given the cost of it. No, the Genbu. That was it. It was the Genbu. So we ended up fighting the Twin Guard and the Steel Empire at the same time. We fought the Twin Guard last. They ended up being the final boss, and I think I would say they are the final boss. They are very cool. This guy, for example, I remember you. This lance is tipped with a nuke, and it's actually surprisingly good at landing a strike with it, and I dread to think how much development time it took to get him accurate with that thing. But yeah, they have a lot of their mechs. They're very tough. I believe we eventually killed it by destroying the body, doing about 80% damage to the base, and the base actually drove off into a lake and drowned. I didn't even see it happen. I literally came back from a break, and it was dead. Or it died immediately anyway. But yeah, they're tough. I had to bring numbers. I didn't have another way. I didn't have tanks of high enough quality. I just had to bring enough. It did make the final battle a bit laggy, but I don't hold that against it. It's the way I chose to go with it. And again, the game's reasonably well optimized. It does struggle a bit more. If you get up to the same sorts of volume in this than you do in the stock campaign, it's going to be worse, but that's usually because your craft are way bigger, or way smaller in this. And that segues neatly to my next point. Actually, the Empire has a volume limit. That's why I loaded specifically the Rosalie, because I believe it's right on it. Yeah, 25,000. 25,000? 2,500. Sorry, I've added an extra 0. That's each individual 1 meter block will take up 1 of that. Smaller bits will take up a bit less. So it's a limit. It's basically going, hey, you can build up to a certain size. Again, this is right on that limit. This is probably a fairly average size for something of that that's right on the limit. It's pretty densely packed. And no bigger. And it's, in some ways, quite a neat idea. It means you have to be a bit creative. You might have to build tanks to work in formation because they're not powerful enough on their own. You can't just build a super weapon. But the AI cheats. The AI doesn't follow that limit at all. As you probably have seen. I don't even need to load anything to show it off. You've seen it, but let's show a good example of it. It's not the Relentless. What's the big one? No, I'm going to summon you because you're a right pain in the campaign. This is another resource in craft that gave us a nightmare, by the way. This is the Atreides. Cute dude reference. Land hauler and airship. This thing's monstrously tough for an airship. This is not a hydrogen balloon. I don't know what's in this thing, but... or from pure titanium, possibly, but yeah, this thing was fine. It's cute. I like it. It rams. It's reasonably durable for about what you'd expect. No problem with this. This thing is a monster, and it doesn't look like it should be. But you might have also noticed 6,800, 2,600. They're well above the volume limit. Even that little one is below the. Even the smaller one is above the volume limit. Even I've said volume so many times I can't say it properly anymore. Now for bosses, I'm good. In fact, I'd be sad if the bosses didn't cheat the volume limit. I believe their boss is the Goliath, I want to say. I'm not even 100% sure on that, but I think it's the Goliath. It is... oh. It's changed. I haven't seen this. I assume this is still... I think this is the right one. I think it's changed. I love this mini helicopter. I hadn't seen this. But yeah. I believe this is their faction leader for the Steel Empire. Could be completely wrong. Yeah, it's set up in the same way. I think it's had an overhaul, which is impressive because it hasn't been that long since I finished the land campaign. But yeah, the bosses cheat it. Fine. The regular enemy craft also cheat it. And the problem here, this goes on to something I said I'd get back to. Crafting from the depths don't scale linearly in power with their size. Twice the volume limit often means more than twice as strong. You've got more space for armor. You can fit much more powerful guns. You could add just a defense system that's like way more powerful than anything of the size, anything at the volume limit could actually fit. And combined with the fact that the Steel Empire especially is very well built, I'd argue this means that the campaign is quite a lot harder than Nita. It's not a bad thing inherently, but it's something to keep in mind. And the other thing with the volume limit is it kind of doesn't matter. After all that, it's optional anyway. You can do a campaign that doesn't have it. I think there's 2 versions of it. Or it's tick box or something like that. But, A, you can get past it with just bringing more tanks. I mean, you guys on the channel love the Momica. This little thing. God knows how many variants people built. It's not big. It's like 750 and it's only like 13,000. We had a lot of these. Most of the forces that ran them had like about 10 of them. At least. And they're not expensive to rebuild. Although it was normally the more advanced Momica 2, which I believe was still not very much. Yeah, 15,000. And there's also another way to get past it. So, apart from just bring more tanks to a fight, because there's no limit to how many you bring, you can build something like this. If I can find it, the Hilda. Yes, you might notice this looks quite a lot more substantial than the others, and that's because it is. It might still be about to die to this airship, because again, it's an absolute monster, but then again, don't count the Hilda out. It is very good at coming back from supposed death. Also moving extremely fast. Go chase it. But yes, if you build things that are like multi-part, I'll show the Hilda off on its own. You could just completely ignore the volume limit. As long as each of these parts is within the 2,000 or 2,500, it just doesn't matter. And they are, like the core is like 1,700. Each of these plates is 1,700, but there's 600, but there's like 6 of them. These pods are almost the volume limit on their own. They're the weapon systems. Like, yeah, if you actually use the systems that are intended for like carriers or the drone ships or the mechs, you can just negate the volume limit. It just doesn't matter. Even if you like, the only thing keeping you to it is the honor system, which is something that's true across a fair few aspects of this game. But yeah. And it's kind of weird that that's how they do it. I don't know if this is entirely a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a thing. And it's something worth keeping in mind. We'll set them off with a bit of a fight while I talk about the next bit. Now, I also want to expound upon something I said at the start of the video. So let's scroll the script up a little bit. One of my biggest problems with From the Depths is that this is the same game that I reviewed a couple of years ago. It's not entirely true. As you've seen, there's a few new things. Even I've seen some new stuff today. But there are no significant new systems. Yes, I know they added land adventure mode. And they've done bug fixes. But there's nothing truly new. Adventure mode was already in the game. They just added a tank version. Like, yes, it's a new thing, but it's a bit of balancing and, like, a new map. Maybe. I'm not even sure if it is a new map. That's it. Like, there's no new weapon systems. There's no new engineering systems. We still don't have nuclear. I don't care so much about nuclear, but we still don't have plasma. We still don't have fire. We don't have any new cannons. Nothing. I don't even think we've had any new weapon components for existing weapons. And it's a real shame. So I'd really like some new stuff. Something new to play around with. For all the Stormworks flaws, and you saw me cover Stormworks on the channel a couple of times, it's flawed. And it gets new content frequently. They added oil drilling just like a couple of weeks back, and even though I haven't touched it yet, it's quite a big thing. It's quite a lot to that system. Like, even if Stormworks tends to be a bit buggier than From the Depths and certainly performs less well, it does at least get new stuff added to it. It keeps me coming back occasionally. And From the Depths is stagnant. It's very stagnant. I don't think I've heard of anything major planned for it. Now, the one thing that I have heard them planning is that Glau is getting a rework, but I don't care about Glau, and I genuinely, I'll take your word for it, guys, but did anyone really care about Glau? I didn't play it at the time when it was new. Like, it's a neater campaign, but with less vehicles, less exciting themes, and the volume limit, and the volume limit's got problems. I've just got over it, as well as not mattering. I don't know that it works 100% because the enemy cheats it too. You're not really building a better craft, you're building something that you're building for numbers, effectively. And I know that games can fall into the pitfall of adding more and more until it breaks down. I was there when Space Engineers added planets. And I wanted to love planets. I liked Space Engineers at that point. I really played a lot of it, I was enjoying it. It had some weird moments. I tended to play creative most of the time, but I did like it. And then they added planets and it stopped running. Or it barely ran on my machine and I couldn't work out how to downgrade it. It didn't work. It's never worked. Even on a way more powerful machine, planets don't work for me. They just don't run at a decent frame rate. I'm just like, I'm not playing this. It's just bad. It's not fun. But I think that's because a lot of those games get into a bad state because they had too much. It's a little bit of what Stormworks suffered from. From the Depths is the opposite. From the Depths runs well. It's optimized well. But that's kind of the extent of anything new. They have also been running a couple of DLCs to try and raise funds. This is probably because it's a game that, like, it makes its money once and it can't make it again. There's, like, it's not had a hugely fast-growing audience. So they tried to do a couple of DLCs, and they were character packs. One of them is Vega Realistic. My character, for example, is still the default guy. I think there's another type of robot, but I look like the default Rambot. And one of them's anime girls. Now, don't get me wrong. I like anime. I play Super Robot Wars. Like, you guys know I love anime. I don't have any complaints against it, but it's weird feeling. So this is a game about building, like, warships and things. It's like, I know anime does cross over that a lot. But it's weird that a paid anime girl character DLC is what this game went for to try and raise funds. Maybe it worked. They did the realistic one afterwards. Maybe people bought it and they thought this was a good way to go. But yeah, I really think this game is do something new, something big, and it should be to do with building. Building is the strongest part of this game. I really think it should be a new system. I would say a weapon. It doesn't have to be a weapon, but I would say a weapon is probably their best bet. Maybe a cluster munitions weapon of some kind. There's a little bit of that with missiles, but it's really fiddly. Which could just be a new ammunition for an existing weapon. Perhaps a new energy weapon, so kind of bouncing laser maybe or something, or homing laser. Homing weapon could be interesting actually, because most of the weapons kind of don't do that. Something like homes even more strongly than the normal lasers, or maybe a new cannon type. You could do something like the old After Cataclysm mod used to do. It was like a turret system where it had to take into account things like you had to have elevators that actually physically went through the turret in the right place, not the simplified ones we get, like actual. No, the elevator has to go to here. You need a proper ammunition carousel, like all that kind of thing. I don't know exactly what, but something like that. I think the game could really do with shake things up. And unfortunately, After Cataclysm hasn't worked for years, so I'm genuinely tempted at some point to downgrade my game just to play it again. But I think that's what it needs. Something new like that to get people in. Without that, I'll load the crowning glory of everything I've ever built in this game while I do my sort of final summary. I know this video's been a little rambly at times, but I like to think it's got my thoughts across. There we go, the Sky Manta. Which I think summarizes the game quite nicely in some ways, in that it is big, functional, many parts, but a little bit jank. Because From the Depths is a weird one. It still has, I would argue, some of the best, well, maybe even the best in-depth vehicle building for combat vehicles. You've got so many options. Nearly everything's modular in the best way. Like, the advanced cannons alone could do so much. You can set them up for flat, armor piercing, like, shield breaking, like, skimming the water or punching into the water. Like, there's so much you can do. And there's so many good designs for craft and enemies to fight and, like, cool lore and stuff, technically, even if it doesn't get bought up much. All marred by, from having played the campaigns now, really just awkward and constant, like, mechanical issues. Stuff like winning fights you probably shouldn't have, or losing fights you shouldn't have, like, where you should have been able to get away. And just the stagnation. It is a game that's still great. I put over 1,100 hours into it. I don't do that for games I don't like. It just doesn't happen. And I think it has the potential to be better, but while I don't think this is always the way to go for a lot of games, I think it needs new content. I think if they want to bring new people in, they need to add some big new stuff where they can be like, hey, new weapon system, new engineering system, like maybe underground vehicles, make the drills functional. Maybe you can go underground and add some weapons to fight underground vehicles. Maybe, like, again, plasma and fire that they'd already, like, tried to do. Maybe some kind of, like, reflecting laser system, or like the super gravity cannons for Arpeggio Blue Steel. You probably can't use those directly, but it'd be cool. You've done an anime crossover already. Maybe you could go talk to the guys who wrote it. something like that. And just a few fixes to these little issues, like the free fight stuff. The most basic thing I can add is give us a little warning icon that tells you you're out of materials when you go to select a craft before a fight. Just that little icon that maybe flashes a little bit that just warns you, hey, your vehicle's not got any fuel on it. If you start the fight now, it's going to lose. Something like that. So, yeah. From the Depths is a great game, but it can and should be better. And if nothing changes, as it really kind of just hasn't over the last 2 years, I don't think I'll ever be back for a third review. But if they do change something, I'll be right there for it. I'll see you guys all again in the next one. However, before I wrap things up entirely, I am a games dev. I made this channel to try and promote the work I'm doing. I want to make a career out of it. I'd love to be able to make games. And if I can keep doing this, I can also keep making these YouTube videos. Like, if I make enough money off that, I can do YouTube as well. So it really does mean a lot to me if you guys would check out the games in the description. The two I've made, Sel Quinta and IORC. IORC's a sort of action 2D game about flying a, effectively a space fire craft almost around, I believe. Actually, hang on. I can show this off, because Mew very kindly made a few copies of them, even ran one in the tournament. There's a community build, Mew. I think he had a standard one. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, flying this fella around in 2D or 2.5D. Try to stop space debris from crashing to the ground. It's a lot of fun. It's not very long, but it's a lot of fun. You might like it. And the other game is Sel Quinta, which is an RPG. Runs about 12 hours for a new player. Some pretty tricky fights. It's challenging. And it's got a sequel coming out very soon. Hopefully next month or the one after. It depends on how long Steam takes to do the checks and how long the final playtesting does. I'm about halfway through final playtesting, so I can't imagine it'll be too much longer. But yeah, if you guys would check that out, really mean a lot. All the normal subscribe, like stuff, that all helps. Comments, I'm happy to chat with people in the comments. Like the first From the Depths review really helped build this channel. Like, I don't think YouTube that I don't realise how many more views the From the Depths videos get than anything else. I'm aware. I'm trying not to let my channel get bottlenecked, but I know how much more it gets. So yes, I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.